This presentation examines Arthur Eddington's two tables from an Aristotelian perspective. How can Aristotle help us think about the conflict between modern science and our ordinary conceptions of reality? For an annotated bibliography, please see the link beneath this video. We'll first examine the problem of the two tables as Eddington presents it. After this, we'll ask in what sense the two tables present an authentic predicament, and then clarify the dilemma. We will then turn to Aristotle and explore how his theory of substances and the categories might shape this inquiry. The problem of the two tables. Arthur Eddington, a popularizer of science in the early 1900s, particularly Einstein's theory of relativity, proposes a problem in his book, The Nature of the Physical World, published in 1928. Here are a few excerpts from the introduction. There are duplicates of every object about me, two tables. One of them has been familiar to me from earliest years. It is a commonplace object of that environment, which I call the world. How shall I describe it? It has extension, it is comparatively permanent, it is colored, above all, it is substantial. It is a thing. If you are a plain common sense man, not too much worried with scientific scruples, you will be confident that you understand the nature of an ordinary table. Table number 2 is my scientific table. It is a more recent acquaintance. It does not belong to the world previously mentioned. There is nothing substantial about my second table. It is nearly all empty space pervaded, it is true, by fields of force, but these are assigned to the category of influences, not of things. Even in the minute part, which is not empty, we must not transfer the old notion of substance. I need not tell you that modern physics has by delicate test and remorseless logic assured me that my second scientific table is the only one which is really there, wherever there may be. Yes, no doubt they are ultimately to be identified after some fashion, but the world studied according to the methods of physics remains detached from the world familiar to consciousness. Eddington goes on to illustrate the counterintuitive problems which have become familiar to many students of science, that the atom is not a spatial being in the ordinary sense, nor its components. The common sense table is therefore made up of very uncommon sense elements. That is, the spatial, local, firm, perceptible table is made from atoms which are not spatial, local, firm, or perceptible. It is as if the substantial table is a function of human experience and not a physical reality. What is the status of this problem? Is it really a problem or just a thought experiment? As Eddington makes clear in his introduction, there is no real problem for a man in his everyday business of life. He acknowledges from the get-go that these two tables must in fact be two aspects or two interpretations of one and the same world. But the reconciliation of these two views, as he states, stands outside the scope of physics. We might begin then by acknowledging that the locus or source of the dilemma, the duality, is in man himself. It is in man that such apparent paradox or contradiction emerges. The table has no trouble here, nor do animals experience this dilemma. The real problem is in determining the meaning and consequences of these two views. Does one view absolutely invalidate the other? Does it turn out that ordinary experience simply misleads us? It's no easy task to think both these tables at once. Perhaps they cannot wholly be reconciled. But then, must one be a fabrication of thought, or an accident of a certain linguistic community, as thinkers such as Alfred Ayer suggest? Ultimately, whatever the resolution may be, we must recognize that a problem does stand before us. This is because we are not simply beings of action, but beings of reflection. We desire to know. We wish to understand how such can be the case. Therefore, to dismiss this problem as irrelevant is really to dismiss our innate longing to know. It is to ignore what is perhaps most fundamental and characteristic about human existence as such. In his book, The Philosophy of Knowledge, Kenneth Gallagher states that we wish to understand what is the character of the reality which allows itself to be the subject of such diverse references. To put it a bit more classically, we want to know why and how being is spoken of in many ways. So let's acknowledge from the get-go certain non-starters. First, whatever view we take, our practical life is hardly affected. We're not at risk of losing contact with the world of action. Yet, even in the realm of action, in the realm of morals and values which stand between action and epistemology, our exploration of this problem may have some import. Whether I am truly just a bunch of atoms or a creature with a distinct, meaningful teleology makes a great deal of difference. Second, this problem cannot be solved at the level of language alone. It is not enough to say that scientists speak one way and common sense another. Such a solution is tenable only if we believe that knowledge is itself a function of language, that we are ultimately dealing with words and not things. Such would be a concession to non-knowing, to a theory of communication without access to reality. Most of us are hardly ready to concede that the world we know is created ex nihilo by words. Rather, we believe that the ways we speak reflect not just the communities we're in, but the realities which these diverse communities are attempting to grasp. Third, we can agree with Arthur Eddington, who states that science is itself dependent upon our common sense view of things. All its measurements rely upon instruments and upon scientists that exist in and presuppose the concepts of everyday discourse. The language of the physicist presupposes the world of the ordinary man, says Gallagher. Yet this does not preclude certain realities or elements which are in no way ordinary. And it is this we want to know, the link between the strange and the ordinary. Before we turn to Aristotle, it seems fruitful to reconsider Eddington's thought experiment. Imagine you had a zoom camera of the most extraordinary quality. You might zoom in on your wooden table and see its grain pattern more clearly. As you continued to zoom in, you would see the ligneous structures of the wood and its individual cells finally. At this point, no one would suggest that the table has proved not to exist, that it is merely an anthropological illusion. One might readily admit, though, that he had not seen all that was there. But what if this remarkable camera had not yet exhausted its powers? What if it could reveal to you the very atoms which compose the table, or even the electrons and quantum components? Our viewer in such a case might truly respond, "I never imagined. This stuff is not what I thought it was." Yet at the same time, because this kind of magnification preserves a continuum of perception, the original table remains linked to its atomic components. The structures are now revealed, but the table remains. But Eddington presents a more difficult case, because in reality it is not a matter of zooming in. Rather, the problem is in using our eyes. Our eyes only have access to one world and thus seem to prejudice or even deceive us. The vehicle by which we apprehend physical reality under ordinary conditions is itself responsible for creating the image of the ordinary table. Our senses are utterly incapable of apprehending an atomic table. The camera we have imagined is not a realizable camera, because the way in which we see is not commensurable with the way an atom can be grasped. An atom can be rendered digitally through microscopy, but it is never visible to the human eye. And as we move to the subatomic level, it is not just that these objects are so small we cannot see them. Rather, they are of the size that they're not resolvable by light. The real question becomes whether seeing the table as our eyes do is an accident of our physiognomy. In other words, are we guilty of some kind of anthropocentrism if we claim an objective reality for the objects we see as we see them? As a note, we're not discussing today the problem of secondary versus primary qualities, color, smell, touch versus extension and quantity. Such a problem is related to the question of ordinary perception and to Aristotle's psychology, as proponents of virtual realism have shown, but it goes beyond the scope of this presentation. In moving forward, it is not satisfactory to simply reassert an Aristotelian cosmology or philosophy. As Gallagher points out, epistemology in philosophy is not achieved through calcified terms or dogmatic proclamations. I will do my best to show how Aristotle's way of thinking about substances, elements, and categories can help us shape this conversation. At the same time, I will attempt to show areas where Aristotle has been corrected, where his theory could be informed by scientific advance, and finally, the limits of his theory insofar as it leaves us at the crossroads between scientific materialism and a more robust conception of substance and teleology. In other words, neither science nor epistemology alone can be wholly decisive here. The deepest questions demand that we do not hermetically seal off science from metaphysics. We do not have the space here to explore Aristotle's whole concept of substance. Let's recall certain key aspects: that substances are independent wholes, and let's explore the nature of the elements and matter. A substance is a being which is an independent subject, which has a nature, an essence, an act. A substance is a being in the primary sense. A nose, for instance, is not a substance and does not have an essence, because to be a nose is to be part of and depend upon something more fundamental, an animal. Further, a dead animal is not a substance in the primary sense because it no longer has a source in itself of unity or actuality. It is composed of what are now only elemental parts, which operate according to their own natures, or better, according to nature as a whole of which they are parts. From what is said, we can note that the term substance is used commonly with less precision. It has two uses to note here. It is sometimes meant as stuff or matter, or it is used to refer to the fundamental building blocks of nature, such as atoms or molecules listed on the periodic table of elements. This use is prevalent in scientific and contemporary philosophic circles. The first use mentioned, substance as stuff, may or may not coincide with Aristotle's understanding. This is because it makes no distinction between lint in my dryer and the cat sleeping in the living room. For Aristotle, these are not univocal beings. In its second use, as the fundamental building blocks of nature, we're left wondering about the nature of atoms and molecules. Do they really have the status of substance in the classical sense, or are they just things, entities? If atoms do electrons? And what about quarks? We risk facing the ever-receding status of substance as an independent primary being. Perhaps such entities might stand somewhere between being classified as things and substances. But is a halfway house really coherent? We will return to this problem. The first step we can take in addressing whether ordinary experience leads to an anthropocentric epistemology is by acknowledging that science agrees with ordinary experience in recognizing the existence of macro objects, tables, people, trees, stars. Whether or not a table is merely a bunch of atoms, it is not a bunch of randomly organized atoms. Physical objects are not in continual, absolute flux. Despite the fact that atoms continually move and exchange energies in places, they do all this in predictable, organized ways which uphold the structures of our human experience. The table I type on is not continually morphing into a gas or a cat and then into a quasar. While it undergoes decay and change, it yet remains what it is through a larger overarching organization which was created not by atoms primarily, but by a tree, and secondarily by human craftsmanship. While atoms are fundamental to the quality of this physical reality, they are secondary to the formal organizing reality of these macro or primary substances. The table or tree is not an anthropocentric illusion from this standpoint, but the real organizing principle of the substance, or being, which I perceive before me. Further, this principle is not simply accidental, or the result of chance. Human beings consistently produce human beings. Trees produce trees, or become furniture. None of this is the result of just the bumping around of atoms, but of the agency of overarching wholes. The real challenge to this Aristotelian conception is not at the level of the objects of ordinary experience as such, but at the level of value or inherent intelligibility. Is the teleology, the regularity, the organizing power of these substantial wholes, are they themselves the result of atomic accident or evolution? This is one of the real problems which philosophy and science must grapple with. Not whether such objects of our experience have reality as such, but whether such objects have ultimate meaning or are only chance evolutionary beings. Is current teleology an emergent property? Aristotle himself answers these questions, but such an evaluation goes far beyond this discussion. For some, Aristotle's conception of matter, of the four elements, and his rejection of atomism situates him ipso facto as a historical cultural artifact. But an exploration of these technical issues actually clarifies the possibility of recovering his contributions to this conversation. His view of matter and of the elements is far more complex and nuanced than many treat it. First, regarding matter. The matter of a living animal body is not earth or water or fire as such, though such elements may be found in it. That which is a living body has been organically incorporated into a unique and distinct reality. It is informed matter which constitutes such a body. The fact that matter has an atomic structure seems to stand in direct conflict with Aristotle, who claims that matter is always consequent upon form. That is, matter only is what it is because it has a certain form. Thus, flesh is flesh because of the form of man. Atomism seems to defeat classical formalism, but let's take water as an example. It is important here not to make a straw man of Aristotle's complex hylomorphic theory. Disregarding the problem of modern versus classical elements for a moment, we can acknowledge that a water molecule may be composed of two hydrogens and one oxygen, but that it is not merely these three elements. It has a distinctive arrangement which transforms each of its composite parts, parts which Aristotle would refer to as just proximate matter. It is in this unity that something new emerges, a unique act or substantial whole. even if the parts remain present, sometimes in their original integrity, sometimes transformed, they are usually no longer merely separate elements except equivocally. There is a form which defines water and governs its energetic reality. The act of water is distinct from the act of two hydrogens and an oxygen. We cannot hydrate ourselves with those two elements individually any more than we might serve sodium or chloride on our kitchen table in isolation from each other. There is a great difference between poison gas and salt. For a succinct characterization of the problem of primary substances in atomic chemistry, one might read pages 89 through 90 of Substances and Universals in Aristotle's Metaphysics by Theodore Skaltzas. To say that such beings are nothing but atoms is perhaps on par with the nothing buttery fallacy of reductionism, which Peter Kreeft points out in his book on logic, page 109. Combination here, the presence of atomic structures means distinct formal existence, or acts, even if the parts are yet present in some sense. We must keep in mind that they are not merely Legos, but energy-exchanging, mutually symbiotic wholes. The distinction between a solution and a mixture is somewhat on par with the ambiguity. This takes us to a second technical challenge, to the nature of the elements. It is to be admitted that the classical four elements, water, earth, air, and fire, cannot simply be expanded into or equated with the periodic table, however fascinating a forerunner they are. This is because both of the problem of homeomerous structures and because the periodic table itself acknowledges substructures, atoms, which they themselves have parts. In this regard, the periodic table has more in common with Plato's geometric construction of the elements in the Timaeus. That's because in the Timaeus, the elements are not the simplest entities. They're not triangles or lines. They are only the simplest three-dimensional entities. If the elements are primary substances, and yet they are themselves composed of substances, does not the whole metaphysical structure fall apart? It seems it might. This is because the four elements were to be, as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it in an article on the philosophy of chemistry, at the limits of analysis. In other words, if water can be further divided, then water is not an element. Aristotle's theory of elements is certainly, in its current form, in need of revision and clarification. Considerations of the unity and formal quality of substances and elements requires attention and challenges us to re-articulate what it is that makes a substance and an element, and even whether such a distinction is coherent. Here we can note, though, that Aristotle's classification of the elements as substances was tentative or qualified. While he occasionally refers to them as such, along with animals, plants, and planets, he more definitively ascribed to them a secondary substantiality. Robert Sokolowski, in his article Matter, Elements, and Substance in Aristotle, cites Metaphysics 1040 as strong evidence for this. The elements, Sokolowski claims, are really not such in the full sense. They are substances only potentially. Sokolowski goes on to state that the element-substance theory is not wholly jettisoned, but rather has been qualified. This will be important when we consider the status of atoms in the following sections. It is to consider the relation between primary and secondary substantiality, that is, to explore the analogy of being, that we now turn to the categories. The categories represent the highest genera of being, other than primary substances or primary particulars, which exist properly as beings and subjects. The other categories include quality, quantity, relatives, place, time, position, having, acting, and being acted upon. All these kinds or categories of being are being, but not in the same sense. for all but one of these are beings that are dependent for their existence and intelligibility upon a subject. The distinction between univocal, equivocal, and analogical ways of attributing being is at the heart of Aristotle's epistemology and metaphysics. It allows him to distinguish what kind of things can properly be said to have essences, what are beings in their own right, and it also helps to distinguish when we are considering something as it actually exists versus when we consider something only as it exists in the mind. For instance, Aristotle tells us that we do not mean the same thing when we refer to the health of a person, the health of food, or the health of urine. Only one of these is health in the primary sense. The other senses not only differ, but depend upon the first. Just as it would be equivocal to talk about health of food and the health of a person as if they were the same, so too it would be equivocal to talk about the being of a person, a primary particular, and the being of their height, a quantity, or their skin tone, a quality. This distinction may form the hinge between scientific language and common experience, even as it places a wedge between them. Analogy serves as both a chain of connection and of separation by articulating a metaphysical and thus a conceptual hierarchy of being and thinking. All the modes of being, other than that of primary particulars, depend upon a subject both for their existence and intelligibility. There is no color that is not the color of something. There is no quantity or relation or position that is not dependent on some primary substance or substances. It is in this secondary realm of being and predication that qualitative and quantitative abstraction occurs. Thus numbering and all mathematical objects related to quantity, surfaces, and multitudes are not at the top of the metaphysical hierarchy. When we consider quantity, being is being considered under a mode of abstraction. To know that two people are two is to know less than to know that they are people. It is to consider what is accidental to them. It is this crucial distinction between substance and quantity which may be of much use for the epistemological problem raised by Eddington. Perhaps we're not considering the table under two equal but distinct modes of existence, but rather scientific analysis is a mode of abstraction, or a mode of attending to quality and quantity as such. In such a case, we may have a partial solution to the paradox. In such a case, the consideration of material as such, of quality and composition, proximate matter, position, motion, quantity, while consideration of legitimate modes of being is yet a consideration of what is secondary. This does not mean that common sense knows best, or has arrived at a complete understanding of the primary particular, but that it is through ordinary perception that we first encounter what exists in the foremost sense. Such ordinary realities make possible all other forms of inquiry. But now the crucial question occurs again. By what right do I relegate atoms to the realm of quantity or quality? Are they not primary substances, wholes in themselves? This is truly an area in need of further investigation, but the following points can be made. First, like the classical elements, atoms may indeed hold a place among substances, but secondarily, ambiguously, and semi-potentially, just as Sokolowski and Aristotle suggest. Second, their very mode of conception is itself mathematical and abstract, and while they're indeed realities, they are not so in a univocal sense to other beings. An atom and its parts do not seem to behave like the beings we encounter in our ordinary lives, and those ordinary entities do not behave like atoms. To impose one order of being upon another is something akin to the fallacy of composition or division, in which a bed of feathers must have all the attributes of an individual feather. The very indeterminacy of atomic and subatomic realities seems to match exactly what would be expected by Aristotle of a realm discovered and analyzed according to mathematical principles. Mathematics abstracts from the actual, and so it's no surprise that objects grasped mathematically should themselves bear the marks of this abstraction in their own indeterminacy. While we gain depth of information or data at the atomic level, it is equally true that intelligibility recedes. Just as with the categories, when we consider atomic entities, we think less about what a thing is in itself and attend to what can be known about it, quantitatively or qualitatively. As Gallagher says on page 119, the scientific object on these terms is not a special entity, but a special way of regarding familiar objects of experience. And as Mary Tiles explains in her article, Mathematics, the Language of Science, the use of mathematics in theoretical science introduces new forms of judgment, not just new vocabulary. They give rise to new kinds of concept, and hence new kinds of theoretical entity, whose character is determined by their role in these forms of judgment, but whose content is determined by their empirical employment. What does all this suggest, and where does it leave us? What this suggests is not that atoms are unreal or mere mathematical constructions, but rather that their very mode of being recedes in existence to some extent when we compare them to traditional primary substances. This is not because they are small or hard for us to think about, but because they exist indeterminately or dependently, just as the classical elements in some sense. In a manner, they await participation in fuller existence, or form part of the whole universe. When we isolate such elements or entities, we truly isolate and attend to what is less complete or less substantial. In attending to them, we may amass more information, but we do so while confronting what has less actuality. We're not attending to the same things when we attend to a table and to its atoms. A table is not just atoms, although it's made of them. This is not just an anthropological distinction, but one which is borne out by the overarching organization of the atoms, which make up the table, or any other primary substance. And of course, as an aside, even a table from this perspective is secondary, for it has unity as a table only accidentally, whereas animals and plants and other self-organizing unities are first in every way, at least at the natural level. The dilemma we have looked at today presents not just the difference of two cultures of language, but two modes of attention ordered toward distinct modes or categories of being. As Gallagher says on 118, the epistemological advance within science itself in recent times has consisted in recognizing the abstract character of its own way of conceiving reality, and repudiating the projection of this abstraction as an autonomous reality. What is perhaps most challenging about this perspective is not that it asks us to acknowledge larger wholes or overarching unities, but that it suggests such beings have a primary status as beings. That is, that they are more, and thus are more intelligible. The very idea of an ontological or metaphysical hierarchy seems repugnant or arbitrary, but perhaps it is only in acknowledging just such a hierarchy of being that the peculiarities of atomic and subatomic existence begin to make sense. And perhaps it is only in a recognition of hierarchy that we pay heed to what it means to know anything at all. For it is hierarchy itself which captures what it means to overcome the appearance-reality distinction. It is hierarchy which allows us to acknowledge and make sense of the fact that being is spoken of in many ways. Aristotle's theory of substance and his categories allow us to overcome duality and opens a path to the coordination of speech, ontology, and epistemology. Such is a return to the central role of metaphysics. but much remains to be done in this regard. In particular, a deeper assessment of the nature of atoms and of their substructure seems requisite. In particular, we might explore the manner in which they exist on their own and compare this to the manner that they are brought into distinctive determinate states by overarching substances when they participate in such actualities. Also, a nuanced approach to proximate versus informed matter needs to be explored. Regarding atoms and their components, or primary substances and their substructures, we must be careful to distinguish between what Schultes calls related wholes and aggregates. In doing so, we will do much to identify any equivocation. Finally, the problem of teleology rears its head. We are left not wondering whether tables or trees or people exist, or whether such exist as stable entities, but whether such existence is only the accident of time, of evolution, ultimately reducible again to atoms and energies. As stated before, such conclusions cannot be achieved through epistemology alone or scientific investigation. That common sense and science can be reconciled is possible, but that it can be reconciled by common sense alone or by science alone is incoherent. Ultimately, reconciliation begins and concludes in the mind being raised to the creative realities of being. Such realities are known perfectly only by their creator, but can be somewhat apprehended by engaging what is most fully human in us.